doesn't want, so if I have to.
Are we worried about a quorum?
I don't know, there's no.
We will call the Economic Development Plan Review Committee meeting to order. We'll begin on the agenda with roll call.
Blessum,
Here.
Feldner, Hammer,
Here.
Howe, Neither, Nelson,
Here.
Pittner.
Here.
We'll continue with the Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag
To the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Continuing on the agenda, we'll go ahead with the approval of the minutes. Can I get a motion for that?
So moved.
Second.
Any discussion on the minutes at all? Okay, take the roll.
Hammer,
Yes.
Nelson,
Yes.
Pittner,
Yes.
Blessum.
Yes. Okay, moving on to new business, we will continue sort of where we left off, whether Mark or Brecca, if you guys can come up. So we will continue with MAC EDC and your relationship with the city and all things economic development.
So, Chairman Blessum and members of the committee, is there anything specific you would like me to cover? If not, I could give kind of an overview. I don't want to do the full 40-minute presentation I just did last week at City Council or 2 weeks ago. Is
No,
that, because I think you signed that
I
as
think an
homework,
overview would be
right?
great, and then I think from there we can hopefully head into some questions and kind of have a back and forth. I think that's the main thing here.
Okay, absolutely, Chairman Blessman. So as you guys know, you should have a copy of the report that was submitted to the City Council a couple of weeks ago. There was also a presentation given, so I won't go into any of those details. I thought it might be helpful, though, to kind of give a higher level overview. Economic development organizations are supported by cities and counties across the state, and there's a number of those that have different mixes as far as with it. But in talking to peer organizations, a majority of the contracts are contracts for service. So for example, they would be for service for economic development or workforce development or those specific kind of items. But most of them don't actually have prescriptive details. It's a contract for service, and then they task that organization with executing their strategy, their strategic plan, their objectives, and then making sure that the organization has leadership from the funding entity. So for example, when the City of Minot a couple of years ago, it's actually been quite a few, when the City of Minot added workforce development to our contract, it wasn't go do this, this, and this for workforce development. It was, we need somebody in the community to lead workforce development. Can you guys please take that on? And we said yes. And so in that instance, we found that we needed to bring on a position. So we brought on workforce development and military liaison to support two different pillars, not knowing that that was going to be a continuous ask for the city. And so those are the kind of things that we're more than willing to work whatever those key initiatives are. Currently, as you guys know, we're contracted for economic development, workforce development, and military support. Those are the three. And if you recall from the presentation, military is very different. The appreciation events, the programming side of it falls under the Chamber EDC, and there's no city funds that go into that. It's the Task Force 21 efforts that are funded and supported by the city. And then I want to make sure that you just kind of give a high level, maybe more on the funding side. So for example, we are funded by Ward County and the City of Minot for economic development. And in that, Ward County has a representative on our board, it's Commissioner Jason Olson, and then the City of Minot has a representative on our board, a voting member, which is Mayor Tom Ross. And then our board, I thought I'd just give a little overview on kind of the key sectors that are represented on the board of directors. We have utilities, developers, financial experts, entrepreneurs, business owners, legal, healthcare, education, energy, nonprofits are all tied in with our board of directors. And many of our board members actually serve on state boards, commissions, and national organizations. So a wealth of knowledge, we've really tried to diversify that to make sure we understand from the small business and entrepreneur to the large entities like healthcare, education, huge sectors like oil and gas, all of that's represented on our board. So our board's consisted of, I've already mentioned the elected officials, but we have Ryan Ackerman as our chair, Jared Lundin is the chair-elect. Missy Feist Erickson is our treasurer. Cassidy Jumps is the past chair. And we also have Kevin Black, Beth Feldner, who serves on this committee, Pete Hankla, John Connect, John Kutch, Brent Lonis, Dr. Shirley from Minot State, and Jason Zimmerman. And then we do have appointed positions. For example, the mayor of Minot serves on our Task Force 21 and our Workforce Development Committee. So we're making sure that in those key sectors that we're working, our whole board really touches the economic development side, but a couple of those tasks, we have different groups working those efforts. And then we also provide city leadership kind of key positions within some of our different areas. I know that the city participates in our infrastructure committee, governmental affairs, a number of those. Also, we have connected key leaders within the city. For example, like with our honorary commanders program, we've designated key spots. For example, Harold serves on that along with other department heads. And then I thought I would just kind of share a higher level overview. Again, this wouldn't have been in the report to the city, of just the number of touch points that we have with that continuous work that we do. We take the fiscal responsibility seriously when city funds are granted to an organization like ours for the tasks that we're contracted to do. So I have a monthly meeting with the city manager. We have monthly community development meeting that the city manager coordinates with other key strategic partners. Mark Lyman, our economic development specialist, has meetings, semi-monthly meetings, with team members like Brian Billingsley and other partner organizations. We have a position on the Renaissance Zone Board. We have a position on Service Basin Planning Council Board of Directors. We sit in on all of the DRT meetings, provide monthly board packets to the city. Semi-annual report is provided in July. We do the annual report, recapping the full year of activities and showing how we've met the contract deliverables. We do that in January. We participate in the budget process, talking about the current needs. And this last year, we asked for level funding for economic development and workforce development. And then we asked for an increase in Task Force 21 support because of the increased responsibility that we have with preparing the state for Sentinel and our community, of course. We also provide, we do an annual review of the priorities. Harold and I are contractually obligated to sit down, and we do this anyway because we meet on a regular basis and review the Magic Fund guidelines and make the recommendation, as we talked about at last meeting, to kind of the priorities that we see coming up. There's a quarterly business retention and expansion outreach that we do, and then we provide those, we do that every month. We provide quarterly reports to the city, and then we, in our annual report, do a full annual report quantifying all of that information for the city of Minot. We produce our economy at a glance monthly and provide that to the city. We also attend other meetings as requested, and that goes both ways. I know with all of our development projects, depending on what scale and scope it is, we typically have a number of department heads and city officials tied in with those meetings as we're working on development projects. We also do an annual audit of our business incentive agreement with the city, which is tied to the purchase of the land out at the intermodal site. And we also support the annual audits of all the Magic Fund recipients. Kelly Roselli Sullivan, our workforce development specialist, sits on the city's child care committee. And so I just want to kind of give you a line of sight on the connection that we have within the city of Minot, the oversight as far as from city council to the number of touch points that we have on a very regular basis. I thought that might be additional information that would be beneficial for this group.
Okay. All right, any questions for Brecca?
Mr. Chair.
Yeah, go ahead, Justin.
So, Brecca, you said that, so what, trying to answer this question without being confusing, but, so the City of Minot and Ward County provide funding. So
Correct.
do you have a contract very similar to this, that you have the City of Minot with Ward County, or is this?
No, it's more of a contract for services like we see with other organizations across the state. We're contracted to do economic development for the county, and it allocates the dollar amount. It's a one-page agreement, and then there's some of the legalities and kind of information in there, but it's not prescriptive as to how to do it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I'll just add to that maybe, if that's okay, Chairman Blessum, and members of the committee, we sit down annually as a board of directors with all of those key leaders in our community. We have a 5-year strategic plan that really has outlined our 5 key pillars, which is workforce development, community development, economic development, military support, and your member investor side, which is kind of the standard chamber of commerce. Every year we sit down and go through a strategic planning process where we look at the goals that we set last year, the measurements that we're using to benchmark those items, and then we'll go through the process of where are we at today, what are the strategic objectives for this upcoming year. So we don't change the 5 pillars. Those are our guiding pillars of our organization. But we do annually within the board sit down and set our goals, objectives, and really lean in. And it's a combined effort. You know, I sit down with the team and then we work with the board as far as to fine tune those. But those are the individuals sitting in on monthly meetings and numerous committee meetings. The other part that maybe to describe the structure, every one of our board members sits on a committee that serves those 5 key pillars. For example, Kevin Black leads the community development, Ryan Ackerman leads economic development for us, Dr. Shirley leads workforce, and Pete Hankla leads the military support. Cassidy Jelmstead leads the member investor side. And then numerous board members serve on those committees that meet outside of the board meeting as well. So it's a very engaged and dedicated board that gives a lot of time to helping set the strategy for our organization.
Okay. Other questions? Yeah, go ahead, Harold.
Brecca, while you're here, I know we've talked about the importance of business retention, expansion interviews, and those kinds of things. It takes a lot of time, energy, and resources to conduct those, both on the side of the business and providing information, but your staff and sitting down, having those interviews and those kinds of things. In your opinion, are we maximizing the potential of going through that effort? And if not, what would you recommend that maybe we as the city continue to do better to help capitalize off of that information to create a better environment for manufacturing and industry needs within our community?
Thank you for that question, Chairman Blessum and members of the committee. We really feel that we get some good information, quantitative data back from those BR&Es. You'll see that a standard BR&E, business retention and expansion effort, typically focuses on primary sector. There's a very limited number of primary sector businesses that are actually registered in our area. That's limited to manufacturing and some of those other key things that you see in primary sector. Now, obviously, the state, we're supporting the efforts to add tourism to primary sector too. So as far as the BR&E visits, we actually do gain a lot of information. Mark Lyman actually is the one that facilitates and oversees that program, meets with the businesses on a regular basis, but we've expanded out our list. If we only contractually did the BR&E visits for the primary sector businesses, we're talking less than a dozen that we'd be meeting with. So we intentionally meet with other sectors, oil and gas, developers, engineers, others that are seeing development projects. And what we find with that is because we don't attribute the direct comment back to the businesses, they're very open with us. And we've been able to identify, I know we've shared with a number of the city staff and members, where there's maybe roadblocks to business development. If there's processes within, let's say they did an expansion and they ran into a hiccup at some point with the city, they can communicate those back to us, and then we can work with the team at the city to help close those gaps and share, without attributing it back to a business, opportunities to make mine at the most friendly business environment that we can. So I would say that I don't know if there's a lot about the program I would change. We could certainly ask Mark if he has any thoughts too, because he administers it for us. But at the end of the day, I think that's a great effort. And we now, because we've been doing it for so long, we benchmark the data too. Are we seeing challenges still with workforce? Are we seeing businesses investing more? Are they declining? We kind of look at that to see how we're doing as a community. And then I think the annual report should be in the report that we provided to you as well.
All right. Anything else? Yeah, go ahead, Paul.
Brecca, maybe this might be for Harold as well. When you talk about, I'll call it maybe hand-holding a little bit through the expansion process for some businesses or manufacturers or someone looking to establish themselves in our community, is that, I don't want to say it, is that your role Is that, and maybe look to Harold, is there a way that we can improve that on our side? If there is some disconnect, I mean, is that a position that can be brought in not necessarily a new position or responsibility that can be brought in internally, some sort of, ombudsman position, whether it be for the council or a city official to, I mean, again, we have DRT meetings. We do a really good job, I think, of trying to head out any of those roadblocks. But is there a way to communicate that back to the city in a way that we can improve that? Just if that's a glaring issue.
I would say, Mr. Chair and Alderman Pittner, that these business retention expansion interviews are, in my opinion and experience, are pretty critical to a community staying in touch with what the needs are for these major employers and investors within your community. And I think it's a key source of information back to city staff too about what our infrastructure needs, whether that be roads, water, sewer, those kinds of things. How efficient is our processes and processing permits and those kinds of things. I would say in my experience, typically it's not uncommon for your economic development corporation to be the lead on doing those. And it varies in communities. In previous communities I've been in, I've been part of the interview team that goes out and helps do those interviews, right, to help show more connection from the city directly to them. But right now the chambers is leading that because they are also our economic development corporation in addition, so they're playing a dual role there. But again, I think it's critical, and I just want to make sure that we're capitalizing and using that information and that feedback that's coming back correctly. We're getting ready to go into a budget process here within the next few weeks, and so we're going to be talking about our capital improvement plan, right? And so it'd be important to me as the city manager that we have information from these BREs if there's things that we need to do from an infrastructure standpoint to better support our primary sector industries. Now's the time that we need to know that so that we can have that conversation with the council and the community and begin building that into our budget and our planning for the next 5 years. So I think those are critical. Whether or not we need an additional position internally in the city, perhaps. But for me, it's just the main thing to making sure that we're relaying that information back and forth, that Brecca and her team are helping us identify those infrastructure needs. So that staff and the city as a whole can better connect and help address those issues.
So again, and Harold, I think you brought up a good point there that, even in your previous, in your past lives, you've been a part of those. Is there a position, and I'll look to maybe Mark or Brecca, is there any efficiency that can be brought by including a city official, whether it's the city manager, and I'm not trying to get into somebody else's sandbox, but if there's some roadblocks that we can get before we get to a certain point, is there a way to kind of head that off? And I'm not saying that that's the right path. I'm just spitballing here.
Chairman Blessum and members of the committee, I don't know that I would change the structure of the program today. And the reason being is we have, as the advocate for the business community, we listen and we, again, don't say business X said this. We gather information, and because we've been doing this on a regular basis, we used to actually, in the former role of the Minded Area Development Corporation, these visits were done by a member of the staff, board members, and what we found is dedicating one person and having a consistent person leading the effort. And as mentioned, Mark does that for us. We built up the rapport to listen, know what question to ask, understand, but also they know that we're a trusted source and we're looking for the broader based solutions. And that's where the relationship with the city is so important, that we can, the reason why we do it quarterly versus saying we met with these businesses and here's the results, we try to quantify it in a way that provides feedback that can help to make the community a more business-friendly community.
Good. All right, Brecca, so I've got a few questions. So let's start here while we've still got you. I know you've got to step away in a little bit. So let's start here. And I don't remember the exact date. It's something 2019-ish, right, is when the Development Corporation was merged with the Chamber. Is that?
January of 2021 is when we officially merged the two organizations.
Okay, so can you give me just a little bit of history and include in that also what other communities are doing, whether it's around the state or even around the nation. What are the trends in this area? Is that the way this is being handled in a lot of places? Can you give us a little bit of feedback on that?
Sure. So Chairman Blessman and members of the committee, we are seeing a trend to where, due to workforce issues, due to efficiencies with resources, organizations kind of tightening down to lead different efforts, a combination of merging organizations. Bismarck Mandan Chamber EDC was actually a couple years ahead of us making the merger, and so they have merged their organizations. So they, for example, they've received funding from the county and both cities, and so they have, and they were doing the exact same thing really that we do. You have in, I'll use Devil's Lake, for example, the Chamber of Commerce and the Tourism Department are together. And so we're seeing across the board a merger of these, and whether we are tied in with our association, the Association of Chamber Executives, ACC, that we lean in on, or even the International Economic Development Council, we're seeing more and more organizations merging or looking for ways to support their communities and maximize their resources and be fiscally responsible in a way that they're best serving that community. So for the Minot Area Chamber EDC, we started the process in 2019. We saw what Bismarck had done, actually spent about a year sitting down and understanding the process, what worked, what didn't. We not only reached out to them, because they were kind of the lead one, I'd say about similar, larger community in North Dakota, but we also reached out to a number of other organizations. At the time, we had some leadership transitions. The executive director at the Minot Area Development Corporation, we had an open position there. We knew that at the Minot Area Chamber of Commerce, there was an executive director, the president was going to be retiring. And so we looked at it in the sense that we had an opportunity to merge the organizations, but also too, if you recall, the city of Minot invested in the International Economic Development Council report. And one of the recommendations out of that was to look at one brand for the community, which was executed by Visit Minot and the two organizations, which is now one for us. And then one of the other recommendations was to look for efficiencies. There was discussions in a number of working sessions in the public sector, and then also listening sessions with a number of community leaders. And we looked at all options. Do we put all the organizations together? Tourism, economic development, Chamber of Commerce, what does that look like? Which combination might work, or do we just leave the organizations as they stood? For us, I think there was it was a couple years of just strategy and looking at this as a whole, and we decided to make the decision to merge the Chamber and Economic Development Corporation. We also were located in the same building. We knew we were pulling from the business community some of the key leaders to serve on both boards, and felt that there were some efficiencies to bring the two organizations together. And again, you'll also find, I'll just add this, Chairman Blessam, some initiatives, for example, the reason why communities are having these discussions, workforce, chambers are working those, and so is the Economic Development Corporation. There's other efforts like that where they kind of cross over. And so I know of two other communities in North Dakota, I won't say which because I think they're in the early stages, that are looking at the chamber and economic development side of it, and is there efficiencies to bring those together.
Okay. So then, Brecca, if we kind of continued on that thought process, then so they were brought together. Now the city contracts with your team to provide a set of services. That's what our contract looks like. Ward County does something similar. How do you guys navigate and we've had some discussions on this, I think both in the committee and out, but can you talk about how you guys navigate? I guess part of the way they're looking at it is the pillars, but really your constituencies, right? Because you certainly you're answerable to both Harold and the council for the contract that we've got, but you've got member investors. I'm one of those as well in our business, and so you're answerable to us in that. So can you talk about how you juggle those? Most of those align because we all want the city to be successful and grow and all those things. But can you talk about how you navigate that between the different, the different viewpoints?
Yeah, absolutely. Chairman Blessam and members of the committee, we financially have separation of funds throughout our organization. We have a number of designated funds for the fiscal side of it. We also, though, have key objectives and team leads and a strategy under each of those. So when I talk about member investor pillar, that really is your chamber of commerce kind of activities. That's the programming and all of the different things that we offer for leadership and that side of it. Under the economic development piece, workforce development piece, we have a different strategy and kind of clear parameters within all of those. So when it goes back to the strategic plan, you can kind of clearly see, I believe we included in our report as well, how those pillars are funded and what those breakdowns are too for each of the pillars. I know in July I provided an update because of, just to provide an oversight, all of our pillars, how each of them are funded and how we manage all of those different pieces. At the end of the day, I feel we do a really good job of advocating for the business community and leading those key initiatives.
Okay.
And Chairman Blessman, as you know, I apologize, I'm watching the clock.
Yep.
You know, I have a hard stop at 1:30.
Yep, and that's fine. You know, at whatever point makes sense to you. If we want to switch over to Mark, that's perfectly fine. Whatever works. Because again, I've got kind of a line of questioning that'll continue through here. So whenever that makes sense for you, that's perfectly fine. So if we turn our focus now to the economic development pillar, because that, you know, in my mind, that's sort of where our contract fits, although it kind of all works together to a certain extent. The three goals that you guys, that I would assume your board puts together, right? The goals. You want to have Mark come in?
Yeah, he leads economic development,
Okay,
and I
perfect.
have 4 minutes to get in my car and get to my next meeting.
Good
So,
segue. That's good.
Yep, I'll
All right.
have him step in. Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks.
Okay, Mark. So back to under the economic development pillar, we've got three goals, and I'll ask you in just a second to comment on some of this. But first thing I want to know is how those are developed. But just to make sure the committee's got this in front of you, so we advance, or the MAC EDC, the economic development pillar, advances continued operations of the intermodal ramp. It attracts new business investment to the logistics park of North Dakota. And then third is leading the primary sector development in the Minot area. So Mark, can you talk first of all just about how those are developed and how they came to be?
Sure. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, that was done during our strategic planning session. So shortly after the organizations were merged, those were the goals that were provided at that very 30,000-foot level by the board of directors, which represents the organization.
Okay. And so continuing with that then, at what point will you revisit those?
Pillars are, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the pillars are not, and the goals of those pillars are not designed to change every 3 to 6 months.
Right.
That could be every couple of years. The next level down, that measurements, is something that would be looked at on an annual basis. And then you don't see it in your report because this is in the minutia, this is in the day-to-day, but there are dozens of tactics and things that we do, the stuff that gets done that then bleeds up to fulfill your measurements and accomplish your goals.
Okay. So just continuing then with, and really where I'm focusing in here is, you know, I feel like the city's contract fits under the economic development pillar, which it certainly does. But most of it, would you agree, fits under the third goal? Is that the idea, that it's the primary sector development that's the main piece of that? Because really, the first two goals are more focused on MAC EDC directly, right? Because that, I mean, the MAC EDC literally owns the properties, and those are things that are focused there. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I would disagree slightly with you on that, in that the intermodal ramp is not something that we want to own long-term. And that was not something that 20 years ago ever started as a effort to say the chamber's in charge of this, or the EDC, the Economic Development Organization is in charge of this. That was the effort that 20 years ago the community said, we need to do this for the betterment of our shipping and our distribution and our agriculture. And it had failed a couple times. It was a public-private partnership. It was a private entity. And we were ones who said after 15, 20 years, we should step up, take on a very big financial burden, and try and make that possible. But we don't want to be in that world long-term. We want that to succeed on its own in the private sector.
Okay, so
So-
is there an exit strategy in it right now?
Yes, there is. Yes.
Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, and members of the committee, I would say it's not just that third pillar, our third goal of economic development pillar, it's all of workforce development. And there's a goal there to support workforce development solutions. Now, that was brand new when we started this strategic plan. And then it's also the third goal of the military support pillar, support Task Force 21. So just a reminder that there are multiple components of it. Yes, economic development is probably the key, but there are other elements of our pillars that are also tied into this, as you can see in your report.
And I think, just to kind of continue then, and I think Brecca just referenced this a little bit, to be honest with you. I was trying to find it in the report and I can't quite get there. So if you can point me to it, that's great. But can you, so in the 25 budget, as we looked at last session that we held together, where the finance director was walking us through it, the contract for 25 is just under $666,000. Remind me, does that include the roughly, I think it's 75 that we do for Task Force 21? Is that right?
In this last year, in 2024, that would have been, if you look to page 1 of 6 on your service agreement,
It included it,
item
right?
number 6 for compensation is $106,250 for Task Force 21. That's out of that 665,900. So if I'm going to do live math, that's what, 550, five something?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So does that break it out a little bit? That
Yeah, so
Task Force 21 's
that
just
starts
over-
that part. So
just
that-
over 100,000,
Yep.
and then economic development is right around 550.
And so then can you, and you know, whatever you're able to share, if it's here in the documentation, it'd be great to look at again, but just share for the committee then, if you've got some high level breakdown of what the 550, how that's being used within the organization.
Mr. Chairman, I don't have that breakdown of how that funding works. I do know that multiple staff members are directly funded by that.
Okay,
So I know it goes into staffing, goes into things like, when we have a site selector come to town, or when we have a primary sector business, or if any of us might, need to testify on an item down in Bismarck, that requires travel. There might be funding associated with that. So those are the various elements that make up that 550.
okay. And so right now in the contract is the city given a report that breaks that down, or is that not something that's in the contract?
That's not
today?
something that's provided, no.
All right, I guess, for the committee's sake, that might be something that we take a look at is, what should we see a little more detail in how the public's money is being spent in that way? Yeah, go ahead, Jordan.
Yeah, one of the things I know that's in that contract, which is enlightening to see, was, there's no dollar amounts that come with it, but for instance, providing support to the Magic Fund Screening Committee. I can't remember the last time we met. So, one of the things that came with the change in the bylaw or the guidelines for the committee, though, was that applications can be turned down at the chamber level. They don't have to come to the committee. And if you get turned down, there is no appeal process, where under the old format, you could go to the council, where the ultimate approval or denial ultimately rests. In that instance, I guess maybe that some years the city wins if there's a bunch of applications and the chamber EDC is providing a lot of support, and some years they lose if there is nothing going on. One of the things, it's kind of funny, and I'm going to make a gross oversimplification here. We talk about primary sector economic development, and it seems to me like, if it's something, if you can certify that it's primary sector, we're gonna make it rain and throw the money at it. But Brecca even said there's a half a dozen, 8, 9 primary sector businesses in Minot. Maybe it's not primary for Minot at this point. Just seems to me like we spend all of our effort in this community, whether it's city economic development or the chamber EDC, trying to attract those businesses. What about the rest of the businesses in town?
Sure.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, can I interrupt, and members of the committee? And when Brecca mentioned the number of primary sector businesses in town, that's tied directly to, did they go get that certification from the state? You only get the certification from the state if you're going to go after state funding. There's no other benefit to you as a business to do the paperwork to go be a primary sector business unless you're going after a PACE loan or you're going after some infrastructure grants or some of these other components. You don't do that just to say, I'm now a primary sector business. So we have manufacturers in the area that aren't currently on that primary sector certification list, but you and I know who they are, and they've been in our community for decades. And I still talk to those folks, even though they're not on a state primary sector certification list. So I just want to clarify that that aspect of it.
Sure. Paul?
Just, and again, this is maybe along the same vein, just because Jordan kind of brought it up, but the Magic Fund Screening Committee, and I'll play somewhat, I'm a little naive to it, but when an application comes to the Chamber EDC, I'm guessing you guys do the legal review, the financial review of these applications, and does that take place with the guidance and the collaboration with city staff?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, per the contract, we are to review, receive, and conform all applications with a primary sector in excess for the Magic Fund with a recommendation of disposition to the Magic Fund Screening Committee. So typically, we don't have every single application work with the city staff. No. So to your question of does everyone get there? No. But do most of them have some awareness that the city staff is like, okay, this is happening? Yes. But that's our contract. Our contract is to review that. Our contract is to say, okay, you're not primary sector, or you are primary sector, and here's why we think we could help you, either through the Magic Fund, or I would dare say maybe a third of those that we get, or a third of those that have gone on to a FlexPace or some of these others, have started with a conversation with us. So while they might not get to the Magic Fund Screening Committee and to Chairman Nelson's committee, that doesn't mean they aren't helped. That doesn't mean we ignore them. That doesn't mean we push them aside. It means there are other avenues for them to get funding, and so we direct them to Service Basin Planning Council, or to a local bank, or to a grant funding opportunity because they may be a small business, or to North Dakota Small Business Development Center and Mary Beth or Alan, and say, okay, you should have a sit down and have a conversation with them. So it's not a matter of check the box, ignore you, or check the box, pay attention to you. We continue to shepherd them, similar to that ombudsman position that you referenced.
And maybe I think that was my fault. I'll clarify. When an application gets to the Magic Fund Screening Committee, and again, I understand someone's going to come in there and say, I want to open up a cupcake shop, I want Magic Fund dollars. You kind of say, well, that's not what it's for, right? Mm-hmm. I get that. And those are, you direct them to FlexPace programs and other utilities. When an application, and I'll use one, the welding shop out of Stevens Welding. Before that got to the Magic Fund Screening Committee, there is a collaboration with city staff, correct?
Often.
Okay.
I wouldn't say always.
Yep.
That's not fair, but often.
I guess the rabbit hole I'm trying to go down here a little bit is, and maybe I'll look at Jordan. What do you guys do? I mean, and I'll kind of follow that up with, and I'm not taking a shot. I'm just saying, if it's going through the process and it's going through the Chamber EDC and it's going through staff. I mean, by the time it gets to you guys, I don't want to say it's kind of a done deal, but it gets to you with all of the review of city staff, and then it goes to the Magic Fund Screening Committee, and then it comes to the city council. And if someone wants to appeal something, it comes to the city council. And I'm not saying that doesn't serve a
It
purpose.
doesn't sound like there is a.
Can I answer
there's-
that question?
I think that was part of what Jordan said.
Alderman Pinner, I'll answer that question as eloquently as I can. Heck if I know. We got kneecapped as far as I'm concerned. When I first came on the committee, Chamber EDC would come in and they would work with the applicant and get the required documentation together. They'd put a memo together supporting or denying, or a letter of support basically is what I would imagine, what we always would get. And then the first level of approval was the screening committee. And then it ultimately went to the council, and the council would do what it wants to do because the ultimate approval rests with you guys. Well, now that first leg is Chamber EDC under the new guidelines. And if, say under the old guidelines, say the applicant was denied for whatever reason, the applicant would still go, that was a recommendation, that would still go to the council, and the applicant could appear you know, as is their right, it's public money, and, you know, for transparency purposes, that's how it should be. Well, now it starts, it's like a three-legged stool, but we're caught in the middle on the screening committee side. So if it passes through the chamber EDC, I mean, it's a formality at that point. The difference being that, you know, since it's public money, that's why we exist, because there's got to be a group of appointed people, you know, in the public. Now we've basically outsourced that process to a private organization.
But Dave, do you want to add something to that?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I just want to interject a little bit here because historically, some of the challenges we had is we would have requests that would come before the group that didn't meet the criteria of the Magic Fund. So at some point, we have to be able to weed those out without further consideration, because we could find ourselves in trouble if one of those projects were to be funded and doesn't meet the requirements of state law. And just going back a little bit historically, there has been litigation involving the Magic Fund. So we have to be very careful that we follow the rules as they're set forth and that we keep things on track. So to some extent, there has to be the ability to filter some of those requests out before they come to the screening committee or to the city council. So we make sure that the ones that come forward meet the criteria, they meet the letter of the law, and they are valid projects that can be funded.
So one quick question on that, Dave, because this is where my mind sitting on council now has gotten maybe a little off track, actually. Because, and I'm not necessarily referring to Magic Fund stuff. I'm talking more about whether it's Renaissance Zone approvals or things like that. My take sitting on council has been, if it gets to us and staff is saying this meets all the criteria, they're in. There isn't a discretionary thing as a council where we look at it and go, that one feels a little icky. I realize that they meet all the criteria and staff is recommending yes. For me, if it hits the criteria, it's good. Is it different with the Magic Fund? Is the screening committee's role to be that filter that's not, okay, it meets the criteria, but is this good for the city? Is that role?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I just know that because sometimes those requests come into my office. So I see this handwritten letter that, you know, says I want to open a cookie shop and I want a couple $100,000 from the Magic Fund to open my cookie shop. Well, right away, we know that it doesn't meet the criteria as outlined in the Magic Fund. So that example, it should be dead on arrival. It does not meet the criteria. You know, there's other programs they could go and apply for, maybe PACE or FlexPACE or some other revolving loan fund that would be an appropriate funding source for those types of projects. And we would, of course, want to encourage those businesses as well. It just isn't the proper venue for the Magic Fund. So we have to have the ability to filter some of those out because otherwise there would be a lot of requests that would come forward that just are not eligible for that type of funding.
So Dave, before I go to these guys, can I ask you one other just off the wall question about this a little bit? One of the things coming onto council now that's gotten a little iffy for me is we call all of this the Magic Fund. The dollars that we're allocating to be revolving funds in the FlexPACE program through Souris Basin is under a heading that says Magic Fund. So do we need to clean up our language a little bit about what we're actually talking about here? Because there's multiple things going on. I think of the Magic Fund as the primary sector bucket, right? Is there some cleanup we need to do when we talk about this stuff?
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, you're exactly correct. And it is kind of legacy terminology versus a more holistic approach. So when the allowed uses of that economic development sales tax were changed to allow for city economic development initiatives, that's where it kind of broadened the scope of what those funds could be used for. It was the legacy Magic Fund, which is only primary sector dollars. With that change in the sales tax ordinance, it opened that up so the city could take their own initiative with whatever money that they allocated towards that for city economic development activities. And that's where things like the facade program came into play, the wayfinding program, those types of things. They wouldn't meet the criteria of primary sector, but those fall under the City of Minot economic development activities. The pool of funds that are in the Legacy Magic Fund, I would argue, are still governed by the restrictions that were in place when that money was collected. It can only be used for primary sector initiatives. So, we're trying to come up with these guidelines that govern all of this economic development sales tax and carve it out so we can keep track of what is still got restrictions based on the primary sector, plus accommodate any city economic development needs going forward and make sense of it all so we can kind of keep track of it. So your statement is correct. It's called the Magic Fund Guidelines. It includes the traditional Legacy Magic Fund, but it also includes the uses of the economic development sales tax funds since that ordinance change.
Okay, so Dave, just to follow up on that then, so what, Jordan is the chair of the Magic Fund Screening Committee. So do the guidelines say that they should only vet primary sector projects? Is that the intent of that committee?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I don't have those guidelines right in front of me, but I do believe that that is the case, that the requests that come through for the primary sector funding packages go to the Magic Fund. And it is spelled out in the guidelines who is the lead agency for each one of those buckets. For example, the matching program buckets where Service Basin has the accelerator program. The Magic Fund Screening Committee is not involved in that process. Service Basin Planning Council is the lead agency for that process.
Paul, did you have something?
Yeah,
I know you got to run.
Yep, and I'll throw some gas on the fire before I leave. Does the Magic Fund Screening Committee serve a purpose? Is that an efficiency where we have city staff working with who we contract to do the work, and they work in conjunction when they feel when they deem a application worthy of coming before the council and moving to the next step. They work with city staff to vet, these are the strings that need to be attached, and you guys have made recommendations to applications that have come out of the when we've had an application be floated to move to the next step of the Magic Fund Screening Committee, there have been strings attached out of your board's recommendations, correct, in the past? So then it gets to the city level, and then that, I feel like that's our job, Chairman Blessum, when we're at the city council, when we get those applications, I mean, again, it just seems like more red tape, more bureaucracy, and there'd be a way to streamline the application going through the Chamber EDC. And if it comes out of there with a thumbs up, thumbs down, and we've talked about this in the past, maybe we don't have a recommend approval or recommend denial. It's, these are the findings of fact with this application. You guys do with it what you want. Is there a way to make that more efficient?
And I got that sends us down a different rabbit hole that hopefully keep watching if you do have to leave. But go ahead, Jordan.
So to that end, you're right. Like, I've been asking myself since the new guidelines came out, what's the purpose of this Magic Fund Screening Committee, other than the fact that I believe it is in the code that there would be a committee that's appointed to, but it's like the old river channel and we've diverted the water around it, but we still have to exist. But now we never meet. And I want to make this like plainly evident from my opinion. I believe that the Chamber EDC should be heavily involved in these processes. I kind of felt like before the council or the guidelines changed, they still were. I mean, I think in large part there was a lot of times where, we get that memo from Chamber EDC, if it was Brecka, or before it was Brecka, it would be Mr. McMartin, that would say, this is what we recommend, and we'd look and make sure that, everything was in order, and we'd say, okay, we'll do it. I mean, part of it, I look at it from the standpoint, I really don't want, if you qualify for those dollars in my book, I don't want to be the person that's playing favorites. Oh, I'm going to vote against your application because I got an axe to grind with your business. No, that's not right and not proper when you're taking taxpayer money. Like, this is what the money was this is what the code and the ordinance says we're going to use that money for. If you qualify in my book, you should get it. There are guardrails against that if we're competing with, an industry that's already or a company that's already established, some of that kind of stuff. But I feel like we had that ability for the chamber and the city to weed out those potential bad apples before, and for whatever reason we didn't. And we all know which projects they keep me up at night when I'm on the dang committee. My one goal in life is to not be tied into litigation on the Magic Fund. Like, if I do nothing else, I'll still feel like it's a success. I don't want to go to court. But, there are a lot of things for the committee that are confusing. I mean, we get a financial report, but then there'll be hundreds of thousands of dollar things that show up on that report. And I'll have committee members ask me, well, what is that? I don't know. Because the report isn't for, like to what you're saying, a designated Magic Fund. It's for the half a penny or whatever it is for economic development, of which money can be transferred into the Magic Fund, but doesn't have to be. It just seems to me like what I'm concerned about, and I'll just be honest, is anything that is brought to the Magic Fund has to be, it's got to have the word I'm looking for, the legal notice and transparency and things like that. Well, if you take it from government to a nonprofit, I don't know if that stays the same. For all I know, there could have been 20 applications that were denied, and I wouldn't have the foggiest idea as the chair. And as a citizen, I don't know that that's the right way to do it.
Mr. Chairman, if I can interject just briefly there, I don't think it's our job as staff members, or I don't want to take Mark's thunder, but even MAC EDC, to make a decision whether or not we're giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to a project. Our job is to vet that to see if it meets the criteria established in the guidelines, and we've done the due diligence and assembled the information that needs to be done, and tell you that this project does meet all the required guidelines, or if there's any exceptions to those, that those I's are dotted and we have all the information that's required. Our job is to pass it up the food chain then for review. And by all means, the Magic Fund Screening Committee can make a determination whether to approve that project or not, and also the City Council has that full authority. They are the final decision maker in this process, whether or not those projects get approved or not. It's not the job of the city staff or MAC EDC to approve a project. We're just basically compiling all the information, making sure that information is there and it meets the criteria that they have to meet, and it meets the letter of the law.
So with that, Dave, is the opposite true though? That's where I get a little bit concerned, and Mark can certainly answer this. What I would like to understand is, what is the process that's used and who's involved in determining whether it meets those criteria? Because I guess where my mind goes with this is, and maybe this is where it was, Jordan, it almost feels like that the committee should see everyone. And if the recommendation is, hey, they didn't meet this criteria, that's very clear, right? And it's probably 99.8% of the time a very easy decision because it didn't meet the criteria. But what I get worried about is that if a decision gets made and they never even know about it or see it, that does get concerning for me.
Bingo.
Yeah. And I don't know if you have any comment, or if Harold, if you want to add anything there, but.
So if I may interject a little bit and see if I can kind of consolidate all of this together. And you guys have been discussing this as a community much longer than I've been here as the city manager. But my understanding is to some degree, so by ordinance and approval of the voters, we take a certain percentage of a sales tax penny that's used for economic development. It's been my observation since I've been here is that we start with there, but that was being consolidated into we titled that the Magic Fund. The Magic Fund was a fund to support primary sector business, which included some of that money from the sales tax penny that we have available for economic development. And traditionally, that was all going into the Magic Fund at some point. But we were running into challenges where the bank balance just keeps building, and perhaps there's some other uses that we could use this economic development funds on behalf of the community to accomplish other things, until we run into a point that those funds get expended and it needs to be built back up, right? And so then we went through the Magic Fund guidelines, adaptation and restructuring to help us accomplish that in a way. And now we do pretty much call all the economic development funds the city receives through the sales tax the Magic Fund. But now we have these different categories within the Magic Fund of where that goes, which includes the primary sector. And through all of that was this steering committee, when originally the Magic Fund was set up pretty much for primary sector, and all this economic development money went straight to there. The screening committee was there to play this role, right? So the way I see it is there's 3 tiers of filtration when it comes to that primary sector bucket that each of us play. One, we contract with MAC-EDC to receive those contracts because they're working and their expertise is in the primary sector, and whether it's manufacturing, industry, those kinds of things, they're helping recruit those businesses in all the time, helping those businesses expand. They're doing the business retention expansion interviews, all those types of things. They're very involved in all of that. And this is a resource that they can advocate for to help those types of activities happen. So we contract as the city with MAC-EDC to help do the initial part of processing these applications, particularly and it's limited only to that primary sector bucket, right? They don't deal with all the other buckets, right? They're not taking requests from the city council on how the city council would like to prioritize their projects within the city's bucket, right? But anyway, so they're the first filtration. And as Dave stated, their job is to make sure that it meets all the criteria in accordance with state law and the Magic Fund guidelines, that those qualify to be considered underneath the Magic Fund bucket. Or I'm sorry, the primary sector bucket within the Magic Fund. Filtration step number 2 is the steering committee, which the council is set up with community leaders and experts within the industry that can take that from a purview of community leaders that can look at this and say, does this meet the goals and the priorities that we feel need to be a part of our community, right? And then the third filtration step is the city council that deals with the politics, right? The citizens that say, I don't want that next to me. I'm worried about what the environmental impacts will be if you bring this business in, those kinds of things. And the council is that kind of final check and balance that this is the best interest of the community. This is worth the investment of city taxpayer dollars, those kinds of things. So you have these 3 tiers of filtration that happen through that. So staff that just does the basic level, checks all the legal boxes, everything meets the criteria. The screening committee should be looking at it from a community leadership standpoint, from the baking industry, all those kinds of things, that this makes sense. It's a smart investment. It's going to create a big return on investment for the community, those kinds of things. And then the council finishes it off with all of the political considerations, right? And if it passes through all 3 of those things, then we've probably done our due diligence as a community that it makes sense, right? Now, if this group wants to talk about whether or not we need all 3 levels of that filtration, that's fine. But as I understand it, observing and coming in from the outside and trying to piece all this history together, that's what I understand to be the rhyme or the reason and how that's structured.
And I guess just to comment on that, I actually like those 3 layers. I think that is what makes sense. It was actually surprising to me with the latest guidelines to kind of understand that the screening committee wouldn't see all of them. That to me feels like where things break down. Because to me it'd be easy enough to just bring it with a recommendation that says, unfortunately, it doesn't meet the criteria. That's straightforward.
That's what I'm saying too. If it's not gonna pass muster, shouldn't the application be like not put forward, like withdrawn? If it just doesn't qualify, like if it's going to move on, like what I'm saying is, it would be one thing if you had 3 committees all subject to the same level of scrutiny from an open meeting standpoint, all accountable from a governmental standpoint. But one of them is a non-profit that is accountable to its member investors. That's where I, as a person, run into issue with that.
And that gets back to my first question of Brecca today, which is how does the MAC EDC organization navigate that in the first place? Because you've got things that are pulling that in multiple directions, and all kinds of reasons why there's conflicts that occur all the time. And in fact, in my mind, that's why it aligns them to only being able to work in certain sectors. You know, it doesn't make sense for you guys to be in the retail world or to be in the restaurant world. You know, that's just the way that works out, because you're immediately competing with member investors right off the bat.
And frankly, it is probably smart to do it that way. But good government is transparent government, and I get concerned that what I really don't want to see is somebody who maybe they qualify, maybe they don't, but they have the right to ask for that money, whether it gets approved or denied. You know, it's taxpayer money, and I get a little concerned with we're muddying the waters of, you know, proper transparency in that aspect.
So Mark, I jumped in front of actually asking you, can you tell us a little bit about how that process works? So if somebody walks in and says, hey, I think we'd like to take a run at doing a primary sector project, what does that look like on your guys' side?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It can look like a lot of different things. So a primary sector idea can be a $1 million idea, and we're working on two that are $2 billion ideas right now. So it starts in a lot of different places, but if they're specifically going to ask for Magic Fund or get to that point where Magic Fund is a possibility, there's an application that they fill out, and they have to supply that to us, including financials, pro formas, handful of other items that aren't coming to the top of my mind right now. I'll admit I was prepared to have a service agreement conversation, not a Magic Fund conversation today. And at the risk of extending more meetings, I didn't necessarily want to push this conversation off, but that application then comes through my office or others in the staff. We have a list of things in the Magic Fund guidelines that says, do you do this? Do you do this? You know, there's about a dozen of those. And we coach them before they even get the application. Are you going to meet these things? So before someone even fills out the application, before they would even technically have submitted something, that's probably where most people know, oh man, I'll never qualify. I can't recall in the 4 years almost that I've been there, I can't recall if anyone has filled out an application all the way through that point. I think there was one that still came all the way through, that said, oh man, they could see the writing on the wall. I'm not going to qualify for the money. Therefore, I'm not going to go through the effort of giving you all my financials, which at some point, as a quasi-public entity, you know, we would have to supply that if someone did say, okay, well, who applied for the Magic Fund? We'd have to give those financial information. Some of that's confidential and some of that's not. That gets really tricky because North Dakota has good sunshine laws, good open record laws. So we coach them. And then, like, for example, AGT Foods, which had a good expansion recently, they filled out that full application. We had a deadline that said if you're going to want your money by here, you have to have city council approval here. You have to have Magic Fund Screening Committee, which meets once a month when there's applications here. And then we have to have time to approve it here. So we back them up, and that's 60 to 90 days, which I'm not really proud of because I think that's kind of slow. But I get it. There's a process there that you have to step through all these processes. And then we say, okay, get it to me by this point. Then that information I determine, or our office determines, someone in our office determines, does it conform as a primary sector business according to the Magic Fund? And if it does, then we say, here's how it conforms. If it doesn't, we say, here's how it doesn't conform. We give that information to the board of directors of the Chamber EDC, and then they make a decision on whether or not to support or not, and then it moves on to the Magic Fund Screening Committee.
Okay.
And Mr. Chairman, we could do a deep dive on certain paragraphs of the Magic Fund screening, or Magic Fund guidelines if you'd like to. I'm just not prepared with that 12-page document or that history today. I mean,
And
we could do that at a
appreciate
future
Mark.
meeting if we want to
that
go
could be a
down some
future
of
thing.
those.
I think, I'm a little hesitant as well to go crazy deep into that, seeing as it just went through that process.
Yes, yes.
And I although there are things I'm certainly willing to shake up on council, I'm not all that. I don't have that big of appetite to immediately fix things that people just did. So I'm willing to let that kind of continue. And if we want to do that, I think that that's important. But really for me, where all of this brings it back to MAC EDC is more around the idea of what is it that your team provides for the city and therefore the taxpayer. And you have parts of these processes, right? So you're serving a role with that. As I said a minute ago, where I do get a little bit freaked out is that, again, nothing with you, Mark. You and I think are developing a great relationship, and that's a good thing, or the rest of the team, whether it's Breck or anyone else. But under different leadership, I would hate to think that there's a possibility that a project could just go, well, I don't like them. And I don't think that that's the case. And I think actually the vetting you do isn't of that type anyway. There's criteria, and as long as they're being met, it continues. But I don't like that without the next step in the filter to say, well, no, I agree, it doesn't meet the criteria, and that's kind of a done deal at that point. So that's just where I get uneasy, I think, in the process. Yeah, go ahead, Carol.
Just to provide some more background and information, so while we were in the middle of restructuring the Magic Fund guidelines and things, there was a local entity that was pretty aggressive on wanting access to the Magic Fund. And literally the attitude was, they have money sitting there, we're going to go after it, right? And they weren't a primary sector employer, but they were extremely aggressive at all levels of trying to get that approved so that they could have access to those funding. So we try to structure this in a way. So the reason why, we structured it so that if you don't pass phase 1, you don't get to go to phase 2. So if MACDC determines that you're not primary sector and you don't qualify, we didn't want to waste more people's time and resources going to the next level when it didn't even pass phase 1, right? So maybe I'll give an example that isn't attached to anything, just as a hypothetical. Let's say that Sam's Club wants to come and they want funding, and we've got $7 million sitting in the primary sector for sector bucket of the Magic Fund, and so they want to come in and request $2 million to support them coming in. No matter how you look at it, Sam's Club does not qualify as a primary sector. They're not eligible in that bucket. So I would expect MACDC to say, that's not the right tool for you. You're not eligible. So should we bring it to the screening committee? Do you want to consider $2 million request from Sam's Club to bring them in? They don't meet the qualifications. And some of the challenge we had with this last one is, I believe it did go to the screening committee, and everyone's trying to find ways of how to make this work and give them funds, while city staff is sitting there thinking like, it's not eligible. We're going to run into problems, right? And so this system was designed to begin filtering those types of things out, right? That there is lines drawn that this is a no and it doesn't go to the next level. And that's why we created some of that. Now, does it warrant maybe some revisiting and retweaking on that? Perhaps. But that's what the intent was in designing that we're not wasting everybody's time trying to force access to funding that it wasn't designed and wasn't intended to be allowed for.
And so I guess with that in mind, just looking at my concern on it, is it something as simple as a report at least? So whether it's something that you get or the screening committee gets something that says, hey, we've gotten these inquiries, because if nothing else, we get this idea that, well, look, we don't ever get primary sector ones, but we do get these repeatedly. is there a different design of the way that we look at this that we would want to meet those? And I'm not a fan of that in the first place, but I'm just kind of playing devil's advocate with
It's
that.
been a little while since I reviewed it, but I thought we accounted for that. I thought the MACDC was supposed to provide an annual report that talked about how many applications they received, which ones went forward to the screening committee, and which ones were denied and why, so that all that was transparent to make sure that MACDC isn't just denying applications because they don't like them, which I don't think they would do anyway. But I thought that was in the guidelines that they would have to provide that report.
Jordan, do you have something to add?
You know, first to what you just said, Mr. Stewart, I don't think they would do that either, but they could. And that's where you end up with transparency issues, because to what you've said, Alderman Blessum, under different leadership, that could happen. I see that all the time in things down in Bismarck or whatever. I mean, you know, you have good leadership today, but you might not have good leadership 20 years from now. Second, to go back to Sam's Club, if you were to ask a taxpayer whether they would support money to go to something that they're going to get benefit from versus primary sector, and this is a different conversation altogether, because maybe what it's saying is maybe we're throwing too much money at primary sector that's not coming to town, and not enough at secondary or non-primary sector things that would still benefit the community and people in town would want. And there's probably governmental things up the chain from the state level and whatnot that might make it so that you cannot do that, and it might require change in code that would have to go, who knows? But I would argue in the past, I don't know how parking garages are primary sector, but they got Magic Fund money. You know, I'm trying to look at this from a standpoint of what benefits the most citizens in town, because they're the ones paying for it. Whether it's through property, it's not through property tax, it's through sales tax, buying things here. That's where, you know, I'm not saying under the guidelines, it wasn't eligible. We all know which one I'm talking about, but should it have been? I mean, does it benefit the community? I mean, you know what I'm saying? And I think the screening committee got a lot of that, or not the screening committee, the guidelines committee got a lot of that right by providing more latitude for the buckets, so that there's ways that you can still help those projects move forward that provide an obvious benefit to the community. But it's hard to square some of that with, you know, asking the citizens to pay more and more all the time. They should be able to get something for their money and not see it as just a handout to try to attract a primary sector business that'll use the money until it's gone and lose and leave town. That's what I'm always afraid of with primary sector stuff. They come, use up the incentive, gone to the next place that provides the next incentive.
Dave, you have something to add?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, a little background on that. A lot of this was centered around the state's business incentive statutes, which limited those incentives to primary sector industry. So that's where the foundation of that with the Magic Fund was rooted in state law and some of the rules requiring that. So where we find ourselves in today's world is some of that has changed now in state law as well. However, our sales tax ordinance specifically dedicated the proceeds of the sales tax collections for primary sector. So I would argue that that's the only thing that money at the time, the legacy Magic Fund dollars, could be utilized for. So now with the change in the ordinance to open that up a little bit, it's from that point going forward that we can use these funds for these different programs. So we're still in this position where we still have legacy dollars that is restricted for only primary sector, but we are no longer putting funding, or very little funding is going into that bucket in today's world. It's all being redirected to these other things that are now allowed under the new Magic Fund guidelines.
All right, thanks, Dave. Okay, Mark. So let's talk now about what is out there and what you see as really our contracted economic development expert, let's say. And again, I'm not asking for specific projects or numbers or anything like that. But one of the questions that comes to my mind is that we do have a lot of money set aside. I think in the primary sector bucket, I think we're actually just over. We saw last session with Dave's numbers, we're just over what the bucket allows now, and we're gonna have to take action to do that. So let's say it's around $10 million. One of the things that comes to my mind is the types of projects that we might go after. Sure, there might be the $1 to $2 million projects, but there also might be one where 35 million would make it happen. And so I guess in your opinion, based on the projects people you're talking to, the projects you're working on, do we have this design right? You're our consultant on this stuff. Are we using the dollars in a way that's making sense, that does make us attractive, if that is our intent?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I'll use an analogy for this. Burdick Expressway on the east side of town, right by the State Fair Center, gets a lot of traffic for about, 15 days out of the year, 30 days out of the year. Do you build a 6-lane highway out there? Do you build an 8-lane highway to get people in and out of the fairgrounds during those times? You don't, because you can't serve that small of a percent. There's plenty of times when almost no one's driving on that road. Do you bring that back to a dirt path? You bring that back to a 1-lane road? You don't, because you want to have safety and you want to have certain guidelines. You went through a whole conversation a few months back, I think City Council did, about the intersection signal there. Do you want to keep that? It wasn't warranted, but you thought that it was still worth it. I think that what we have in place will work 90, 95, 98% of the time from a funding standpoint, from a attraction standpoint. Is it going to really move the needle if we're talking about a $2 or $3 billion project? Probably not, in which case you involve the state. You involve other players. That's what's happening right now with a very large potato production facility that's possible for Grand Forks. That's what's happening right now with Cerrelon, which is a liquid to natural gas project. That's a $3 to $7 billion project out in Trenton. So not even Williston, but rural Williston. And then, so you have to involve some other people and some other partners if it's going to be very large in attracting primary sector. Magic Fund worked great when AGT Foods came and did a $10 million expansion and bought the old FSA building. And there's good conversations about how can they grow. And the Magic Fund would work great for something like that from a primary sector standpoint. Could infuse $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 into a project that's a really good one. The 10 million that we have in that bucket right now, I think works great for that 10, 50, $100 million project, which is where we're going to be in a lot of competition with other states who also provide a similar incentive. Where they'll need someone to help pay for $1 million road, or they'll say, I need someone to help me match a rail expansion. So I've got a $10 million rail expansion I need to do. Can you guys do 20% of that? Can you guys help me out with that over long term if I'm here for 2 years or 5 years or whatever it is? So that's a long answer to your question, Mr. Chairman, but I think in 95, 98% of the cases that we're looking at right now that are serious, larger, or even middle size, or even smaller primary sector jobs, primary sector businesses, this will work well.
Okay. Other questions for anybody? Okay. So Mark, next then, can you give me some thoughts on if there should be any changes, both to the contract, the way it's written, but also just in general terms to how you guys work with the city and what we're asking you to do. I think I gave Brecca kind of this thought process, and I was hoping that we could have that discussion, because again, we've got it set up one way. We're sort of doing it the way we're doing it. The contract reads the way it does. It has the deliverables that it has set. Should we be thinking different? Is there something that we should be doing different in the way that we interact with you, or what you're able to do for the city?
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I think at this stage in the process, I think things are going really well. From a communication, a trust, and an expectation standpoint, I think that there are really good relationships in place between city staff, whether they're at the very highest levels or the day-to-day level where I sit every day. I think there's a lot of good desire to all work in the same direction. I think that's valuable, and I don't know for sure if that's always existed in these contracts. I can only go back to 4 years. I feel like it's existed in those 4 years that we've had this contract that I'm aware of, that I've been involved with it. One thought on the service agreement, we have A through R, and Q has 3 sub-bullets on that service agreement. I know of other partners similar to ours, Bismarck, Grand Forks, and others, who it's one page, front page is their service agreement or their deliverables. If there was a way to lean in to and understand the trust that's there and say, could we consolidate this down to 6 or 8 bullet points as opposed to maybe larger, more prescriptive pages of documents, you would still get members of the committee, you would still get, and for the public, you would still get a great report. This isn't to say we aren't going to tell you what we're doing, but I think that they would allow us more time and leeway to say we can do our job versus how many times do we have to come back and tell you we're doing our job. We already do 2 reports every year to the full city council. We hardly ever get questions. Usually when we started this process maybe 3 years ago with a newer, more detailed report, I remember city councilmen saying, wow, this is the most information I've ever got on this. And we would continue providing that information. For example, in the services agreement, it says that we're going to keep a website and marketing materials up to date. We'd be doing company malpractice if we didn't have a website. Right. I don't think we need to have, per se, I don't think we need to have that laid out prescriptively, multiple lines to say, have a website and market the city. Some of it goes into items that are tactics, like responding to primary sector RFPs, that's the letter K. Providing touring services for prospective primary sector businesses, that's letter L. Those aren't bad to mention, but those are the tactics that can change from day to day depending on the need of that moment. Pre-COVID, you interacted very differently with site selectors and people because you wanted them to come to your community and you did certain things to wine and dine them. You don't do that much anymore. If we'd had a very prescriptive agreement that was a little older, you'd have been telling us to do stuff that was no longer relevant to the time. I think that's why I used the phrase "less is more" when we were talking 2 weeks ago. We're going to do all of these things on here because these are the right things to do. At some point, I would hope that trust and that communication allows us to say, okay, we don't need to lay out 3 pages of tactics. We can tell you, certain high-level things that we'd like you to get done. You guys go and do your thing, and then come back and talk to us a lot. I think that's where we could make some adjustments there.
Okay. And I think just for the committee, I think that could be a good discussion for us coming out the back end of this is, like as Mark said, it's a long list. And, certainly, Harold, if you got something to add, I'd love to hear it because I think it is different. Although I guess where my question goes is, are we, by asking for these things, if they're met, do we get success? Or do we get a series of activities? And that's in any contract of this type, that's what you have, right? What are the measurable successes out the back end versus did you do all the activity you said you would?
Yeah, if I may, Mr. Chair, question for Mark. So you touched a little bit on this, and I was kind of thinking about this right before you kind of touched on it, and that is, how has, and this has probably even changed a little bit since I was actively involved with regards to site selectors and those kinds of things. COVID changed everything, so a lot of that strategy has adapted and changed. what is the current strategy on how to get the attention of site selectors that when they have a client that's looking for a new location that might not is on their radar and that we're open and ready for business? And then part two of that question would be is because some of that has changed, I think going back to Alderman Blessum's original question, I mean, I would assume that these efforts are covered underneath this $500,000 that we're providing MACDC. So if that's changed, has the costs changed with regards to that? So obviously we're funding your position and your training. You know, what conferences are you headed to kind of stay in front of people, if you're even still doing that anymore? If you're not going to conferences anymore, how much within your $500,000 was covering the cost of you going to that? So if that's not needed anymore, how are you recommending that those funds be repurposed to help you be successful? Or do you even need them anymore? Or is that somewhere that we can scale back a little bit of the funding because we're not spending money on that anymore? I guess I unpacked a lot of questions in there for you, so
I'll see what I can.
good luck answering that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. City Manager, I'll touch on a couple things that are in the report. So page 3 of the report, under strategic plan, economic development measurements, talks about number of site selectors contacted per year. So this last year, we formed 13 new relationships with Upper Midwest and/or national site selection companies. So there's a number tied to that deliverable. Those are individuals that we met at conferences, through LinkedIn, at professional webinars that are virtual. Some of those are ones where they approached us, said, hey, we've got someone who's interested. Some of those came through the state through RFPs. So you really still get access to site selectors in 4 or 5 different ways. 10 years ago, I think the industry standard was you needed to pay for them to fly here. You do a round of golf with them, wine and dine them, and then that site selector is supposed to become your friend, and then you're supposed to be able to get companies that would be through that site selector who would then want to come to your community. I would say that is no longer the majority of the company decisions. A lot of it is more data focused than relationship focused. Do relationships still matter? Absolutely. But if a community has a hard cutoff and says, well, you have to be within 10 miles of an interstate, then we're not going to meet that. We're not within 10 miles of an interstate. Now, can I explain that we're within 10 miles or 5 minutes of 3 4-lane divided highways? Absolutely. But sometimes they're already just kicking us out for something that they can search on a website before they ever get to us, before we ever have a conversation to explain ourselves. Another thing that's in the report is on page 14, underneath the effort that talks about leading primary sector RFPs and meeting with or developing relationships with site selectors. That information is also introduced there. If a person really wanted, I could give you the names of the companies that we've had those relationships with. I think that starts to go into the line of, that's kind of our secret sauce. If I have that good relationship with that site selector or someone in our organization does, you don't go around telling the world you have a good relationship with that person. You want no one else to see that relationship so that you can build that. So part of what we do in economic development, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, is a secret sauce sort of formula. So you want to be open and transparent. I give you the number of how many new relationships were formed, and had a follow-up conversation with one of them just last week on a project that's looking to grow and expand in our area. But that may take 6 weeks, it may take 6 months, it may take 6 years for that to ever materialize into something. So to your question about strategy with site selectors, I don't know that the cost has necessarily changed up or down. I think that you have to shuffle those costs depending on the tactics that you want to use. We do decide to go to certain conferences depending on the people that will be there and who is speaking. If it's a really good conference and we think it's valuable and they're talking about things that relate to North Dakota, we'll try to get there. We've turned down other conferences that are closer that might be less expensive or more expensive because maybe they didn't have the right people there. There are still national or regional economic development organizations that we try to attend on a regular basis. And some of that is for professional development, but a lot of it's for learning and understanding those relationships with other people. Does that help answer the bulk of your questions, Mr. City Manager?
Yeah, I believe so. And just to follow up with another example is, 10 years ago, there used to be a pretty aggressive mailing campaign, and we spent a lot of money printing out brochures and cards and stuff. And then, like 5 years ago, even before COVID, they were telling us, site selectors are like, quit sending that to us. Like, send me an email.
Yeah, put the
And
information on
you
the
don't need to
website.
spend the money on high gloss photograph printing trying to get my attention, because it doesn't. It goes right in the trash can, and you're just wasting your money sending me that. So those are the types of things I was looking at on how we're adapting and changing to be in front of them, make those relationships, but make that connection in a way that's effective, that we're not wasting their time.
Yeah.
But we're in front of them. They know that we're ready for business. And I'll defer for a little bit. Jordan has a question, but I'd also be curious in the future of hearing one of our major resources here that you guys have played a major role on, and that's our port. And that gives us a major competitive advantage when it comes to attracting manufacturing and industry. And I guess I'd like to hear a little bit more about how we're marketing that and trying to build off of that capacity, because a lot of communities and regions don't have access to that.
And I can touch on that a little later if we'd like to. Mr. Chairman, I also want to follow up on one component. Harold points out that you don't do the mailers like you did 10, 15 years ago. It's all online. And so I would say that I think an opportunity we have to grow in this area is to have a more robust, broader data set available online. And I've got some details on that if we want to go down that rabbit hole. It's similar to what the information that's provided by Retail Coach, but I would argue that it's not just geared toward retail sector. It's geared toward any and all sectors. And it's geared on, the data should be geared in a lot of ways to primary sector, because that moves the needle in a different way. That changes your economy in bold new ways. So I think that there might be an opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to say, is it worth investing $20 or $30 or $40,000 a year instead, maybe on a retail side or on a lowest side or some of these other components, and go after one contract. This would be under us, but go after one contract that provides that data so that all the partners have it, and provides a labor shed study. It provides all the information that a person might want when they're looking in just digitally. The latest stat I heard is anywhere from 40 to 60% of all projects start with a Google search. They don't start with an RFP. Which is a request for proposal. They don't start with a conversation at the CEO level. They don't start because they went off and hired a site selector. Someone just Googled, which communities have, lots of soybeans, which communities have rail, which communities have, employment opportunities in these areas. And that is what's starting a lot of these projects right off the bat, is a Google search.
Well, and you can see where AI is going to be coming into that. So, Jordan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I'm taking this back a little bit just because we got talking on a bit of a tangent, and I want to make sure. So, when I went through the agreement, you brought up the website thing. I had a good laugh about that when I was looking at that too, because that's probably that's I would expect that, whether it probably doesn't need to be in there, in my opinion. But a lot of those bullets, most of them are very good, and I'll get it out there. I think you guys do a really good job with all of these bullets. Probably my mindset on it has improved over the last couple of years. I've dug into more of what the Chamber EDC does, and I think you guys have done.
And that's the end of the committee, right?
Yeah, right.
Leave
But I'm saying that as a member investor, or I should be specific, as the CFO of a member investor. Maybe I'm old-fashioned, but the member investors, it's these things, if they're done and they're done successfully, they are to our benefit. Should that be where this ends? Because I'm going to sound overly simplified. We talk about outsourcing economic development to the Chamber EDC, but we also have an internal economic development. And if I just take a 10,000-foot view and we look at, a citizenry that is taking a very critical look at taxes and things like that, do we have overlap? Are we putting a lot of effort and bucket into these things where, the members and investors, if we bring 10 new businesses to town because of the efforts of the Chamber EDC, well, that's an opportunity for my employer to finance one, or that's workers that you could house in apartments. We stand to benefit from those things. Should we be the ones, and I'm probably cutting off my nose to spite my face, or however that saying is, that should be ponying up for that? Because, hey, that's how I was always told chambers of commerce worked. The business community looks out for itself, but now it feels like, well, the business community is looking out for itself, but the city's also looking out for it, and the county and the state, and we're pumping all kinds of money and effort at these things. Is that really the best use of citizens' tax dollars?
And so that's maybe a good segue into what I want to do just for a couple minutes, because we're missing a couple members and we'll have more of this discussion. But that's a good starting point for our discussion, I think, Jordan. So, Mark, anything you want to leave us with at this point? Anything else you want to add?
Always got thoughts.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, well,
Whatever.
I'm just thinking on that service agreement. Are there any questions on the service agreement?
I think in
that's-
our discussion, we'll want to come back to those. And
Okay.
again, it's not to say that you guys have to show up at every one of our meetings. I'll certainly let you or Brecca know if there's something specific we want to go into. But I do think that will be a good discussion for us in coming meetings, is to dig through these and to go through them one by one. But like I said, what I'd like to do is maybe just take 10 minutes here with the committee, talk through a little bit of what we've heard, and what Jordan was just talking about is, I think, the first starting point. One last thing for you, Mark, before you step away. Can you talk just briefly about, so the picture that I have is that the MAC EDC has a board. You've talked about membership. We've got the mayor on the board. We've got Jason Olson from the county commission, and a very specific list of board members to hit segments of the economy and all those pieces. Now, it's my understanding, though, that's, I think of a member-based organization as having an annual meeting where we elect directors. That's not the model MAC EDC uses, as far as I know.
I'll correct you there. There is membership, and you can, as from the member investors, you can say, I like this person to be a director on the board, and you can put them on the board with the right votes.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And so has that typically happened? Is that the path that normally where the board members come from?
Do most board members come from member investor suggestions? Is that what you're asking?
No, that's a different question. Do most of the board members get elected at an annual meeting?
They have to get approved at an annual meeting, yes.
Approved, correct.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, I think we've got I've got friends on the board. I mean, it's a good cross section of what we've got going on. But what we end up with then is the oversight is coming from within in many cases, is the way that I look at it. And this kind of segues, and I just wanted to verify that I had that right, because I while there may be a path, that's not the usual path, is kind of where my mind was
I'd say
going.
it's a typical path for our industry.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yep, that
I
makes
think-
sense.
I
Yep.
think it'd be unusual in our industry to hold an election of the citizenry as to who would like to be a member of the board of directors, Chamber EDC. That
Well,
would be.
and just to be clear, I'm not suggesting citizenry. I'm suggesting member investors. And so,
And that exists. The member investors can say, I'd like this person to be on the board. Me and 5 other, 10 other, 20 other investors can get together, make that suggestion. That's considered, yes.
Mark, I guess I'm going to ask a question kind of piggybacking off that. Is your board size capped?
I'd have to go back to the bylaws.
I don't know that answer either.
I don't know for sure.
Because I don't own my employer's business, so I don't know the answer to this, if we voted or not when somebody to go on the board. Like, I don't know if there are terms and you can run against so and so if you get so many board or member investors to back you or whatever. I don't know how that works.
And I'm not the expert on it either.
Yeah.
I just know that it's not a. I'd have to get more information on the bylaws to make sure that I get that right.
Yep. And again, and that part's all okay. The interesting part for me is not whether a private organization can elect or run its board any way that it chooses, because that I'm absolutely for that. I've served on the Hockey Boosters board. I've been involved in political parties. They all generally have that same idea. The different component here is the public money coming in. And so that's the only reason that I look at this maybe slightly differently. And as another example, there's a bill going through the legislature right now that's looking at exactly this question related to rural water districts, because it's the same idea. Most of the rural water districts, their main method of replacing board members is, oh, shoot, they're not going to serve anymore. What does the board think we should do to add? And at the very least, like on council, when that happens, if we have a council member that becomes the mayor, which is the most recent situation we had, the council itself appoints, but it immediately goes on the ballot. And so there's mechanisms that go with that. So I just want to make sure I had it straight, Mark, and it's not even necessarily something we need to follow up. I just want to make sure that I understood it is sort of a member approval as opposed to an election.
And hopefully I had it straight as well. If I
Yeah,
don't,
and
I will
that's-
let you know.
And if it's different, certainly let us know.
I
But
just don't read our bylaws as often as I read a lot of other things.
sure, no, that sounds good. Well, thanks. Anything else for Mark, committee?
I won't go far.
All right, thank you. All right, sounds good. Okay, so with that, that's Jordan, just kind of continuing down that thought process, because one of the things that popped into my mind with that right away is, if something was completely different, let's say that our economy completely changed and unfortunately we had to divert a ton more money towards flood or something else changes, would the old combination of MADC and the Chamber of Commerce do anything different than they do today if the city funds were not involved? And so, and I throw that as more of a rhetorical, not intending to even consider going down that direction. But my point back to yours, Jordan, is as a member investor, that is what I expect, right? Like that's exactly what we expect the chamber function to do.
Yeah, and I would imagine, one of the things, numbers guy, I pulled the most recent 990 I could find, and 600,000 ballpark would represent roughly 20% of the total revenue. It's probably a little less with inflation because GuideStar is a little old school. Like it's been a couple years, but we're having that same discussion in Bismarck when it comes to who controls the purse strings and what say do they get and things like that. I would imagine, and it would be fair if that happened and the city was no longer in a position to provide their level of support, that Chamber EDC would come to the member investors and say, hey, you got to pony up. We got a $600,000 hole. Either we're going to have to cut services or you guys got to shoulder more of the burden. That's how I would see it to go.
So with that in mind, I as we were going through today, I've got a few bullet points that I think we'll want to get down, at least from my perspective. If you guys have others to offer, please do so. Number one of the ones that I'd like us to consider as we go back and look at the contract itself is whether it's appropriate and we should ask for a detailed breakdown of the spend. So if we're spending the roughly $666,000, that we understand kind of where it's going, even if it's at a broad level. I think the taxpayers likely deserve that, and something we should come back to.
I think that's fair. I mean, if you're gonna get, and I know we talk about, like simplifying the contract to get it from 3 pages to 1 page. I mean, it's not 50 pages. It could be a lot worse. But I'm a big fan of accountability, and I don't think and I think in this case it'd be easy because I think you guys do a good job with the money. But I think you could avoid a whole lot of potential headaches down the road if you got a report that spelled some of that out.
Go ahead, Harold.
I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but I do want to remind the committee that we do have a budget process every year, and any organization that gets funding from the city, we do have them submit that proposal. That's included as part of the budget process every year. We do provide opportunity and time, and MACDC is taking advantage of this opportunity. Or we at an open public council meeting that they come and talk about what they're requesting in the next budget year and why, and that is the opportunity for the council to get this information exactly what you're asking for. MACDC, you're asking for 600,000. Give me the breakdown. What is that going to, or what is that paying for? So that the council can make an informed decision as part of their budget process of how much funding they want to provide that agency. So we do have that built into the process. But if you want a specific breakdown as part of the contract, I guess that's possible, but that should be prepared and submitted as part of their annual budget request to the city as part of the budget process.
Sure. And you know, I guess just from my perspective, I'm willing to work, you know, kind of back to what you were saying, Mark, about, you know, the relationship that's going on here. I mean, there is a certain amount of secret sauce going on, and I'm willing to live with some of that, but at the same time, I think we still want to have accountability. We've got accountability for every other dollar that we spend as a city. And so I want to make sure that if we're diverting, you know, as we look back at what we saw 2 weeks ago, you know, we do have a lot of what we would think of as our administrative costs that's going in this contract. I mean, it's if I remember right, about 30% of the overall dollars coming in from economic development are going into this contract. So that was the first thing I had. The second thing, maybe these go together, but we've got this question around Magic Fund screening that I think we want to take a look at, and that might be one place where we dig into that part of the guidelines if we feel that it's important, but I don't want to lose that if you've got it down. So just what the role of the Magic Fund Screening Committee is what I want to get down there. And then Mark actually alluded to this, which is the actual screening timeline. And if we're digging into that a little bit, if there are ways for us to streamline that, because really waiting for the next scheduled monthly meeting doesn't mean a darn thing if you haven't met for a year. So you could sure have ad hoc meetings if that's what makes sense. Call people together and get it done. Let's move that stuff along, correct?
I wouldn't be opposed to that at all.
Right.
I mean,
Which
I
probably
think
makes more sense.
I think a week's notice. I mean, the only thing that you run into, I guess, is if you have a specified time, everybody can plan for it. But as of right now, nobody plans for it because we likely are never going to meet. So, you know, it would be my preference, and it would obviously the committee would, you know, need to weigh in on that. I would think that we get these things done quicker.
And I think the point would be, you know, you can do it with a notice requirement and say, hey, it's going to be, you know, you got 10 days from this notice and
Fair.
we're meeting at this time and we're considering this. So I think that would work just fine. And then the last one that I had down, and it dovetails with a few different things all at once. And you were hitting on it a minute ago, Jordan. The data repository. So the council made a decision to not move forward with the proposal that we got for retail partner. Yeah, Retail Strategies is the name of the company, but for a partner that would work with us on that side, just to take a look at some different options. And one of the things that's coming to mind with me, and we've had that discussion up here, was the data is really the important part of that scenario. And it's back to that same idea, the website. And you know, the thought that has come to my mind, we've got that similar information at the CVB. We've got, you know, Mark had mentioned they may be able to do something similar. We've got outside consultants that can do that for us. Is there something that we should do on a more consolidated basis that puts Minot's best foot forward from that data package and maybe even a website? I mean, not that, you know, that's not, you know, it's not 1998 where we're trying to get the first one out there and beat others out there. They're out there all over the place. But right now, if you want to see that information, you're going to multiple places. I was having a conversation on this within the last couple of weeks here where I was trying to look for it, and I looked on the city site to get a portion of it. The chamber website has, or the MAC-EDC website has a portion of it. And I know that the Visit Minot World has it, although I don't know that it's published but we get that in presentations. And having that come together into the best foot forward, website's one thing, it's kind of out there ready for the world. But the other part of it is that we have that detailed package that we have been willing to pay for because we paid for it through our retail contract. We've done that in the past, and we were ready to with this RFP again. So that's some of the thinking that council will need to look at. But if there's, I would like it to be a part of what we're talking about because I think that is important. You know, how we make sure that we've got everything available for the outside world is super important. You know, I have a friend that works in that world, and she said, "Hey, best resource you've got is U.S. Census data. There's incredible amounts of information and ways that you can report based on that data that you can go get right off their site and request from them." So I think there's lots of opportunities. So that's the last thing that I had there. Michaela, did you get my spew of information?
Well, the 5 that I have are, like possible further discussion, consideration topics. 1, MAC, EDC provide more detail on how the public funds or City of Minot funds are spent. Regular communication with MAC, EDC, city staff, and the Magic Fund Screening Committee. Consolidation of the MAC, EDC service agreement. Deliverables was kind of something that Mark Lyman had brought up. The role of the Magic Fund Screening Committee and combining and consolidating the data from the different agency for site selectors.
Okay. Committee, anything else that anybody would add to that from your thoughts today?
I kind of had the same, when Mark said a Google search, that kind of where my mind went to a little bit, what you were hitting on there is, and I'd agree with you, I do a lot of that too myself. I mean, it's, find information, I go to Google and type it in, so it's kind of like, how can the city or MACDC capitalize on that? Was that, and that's a whole different world, right, of Google AdWords and all that kind of stuff, so there might be an opportunity there to do something where it's pretty easy to find, for people to find information out about the city of Minot and consolidate that. But one question I do have, I guess, is, every meeting we've kind of had these bullet points. Is there a way to compile those? And I know we're kind of waiting until the end, but I'd kind of like to
Start to
refresh
see
my
what that
mind
looks
a little
like.
bit. Yeah, so I don't know if that can be circulated out or.
So I think the way that I've always thought of this throughout the process is that those would become part of a document we're going to send up to council. And so I think actually we're probably at that point, because I think we're at the main end of these kind of presentations for this work. All right, there are a couple other things that are still coming. One of them, I talked to Alderwoman Lisa Olson today. She asked about bringing the Workforce Development Committee to come and speak to us and kind of give us their perspectives on the work that they've been doing in the city and some of the thought processes there that tie into economic development. We're looking at that for the second meeting in March, because that's when she's available. We also had this generalized discussion about how the city participates in infrastructure for new development. That could be a more formalized discussion in one of the next couple meetings as well. So that's the next couple pieces. But Justin, I think you're onto the right track there. So I think what Michaela, what you and I can do between now and the next meeting is I'll take a start at starting to get a document put together the way that I'm thinking of it going to council, and I'll work with you on getting those bullet points put together. Because really in the end, what we're all here to do, the way I think of this, is work on that, kind of do the committee work on that, and finalize it with among ourselves. And at the end of it, bring a motion that essentially says this is what we intend to send to council. But I think it would be good for us to start having that working document in front of us.
Sure.
Yeah, that sounds good. Okay, anything else? All right, well, Mark, thank you, and I'll send Brecca a thank you as well, but thanks for being here and sort of facing the questions that we've had. I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
I'll second.
All right, any discussion? All right, thank you. Have a good day.